Welcome back. So far in our macroeconomics course, we've talked about GDP, unemployment, and inflation, and we've discussed the relationship between price levels and GDP and unemployment. Then we've discussed how unemployment and inflation is related using the Phillips curve. In this chapter, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be discussing the relationship between GDP and interest rates. And in order to discuss this relationship, we'll be discussing something called the ISLM model. And before we start off with an ISLM model, I'd like to give you a brief overview about this model before we start. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand what the IS curve represents and how the IS curve shifts when there is a change in fiscal policy. We are discussing the ISLM model so that we can figure out the relationship between interest rate and GDP. And in the ISLM, the abstract concept of an economy is changed, and we break the economy down into two markets: the goods and services market and the financial market. Interest rates and GDP behave differently in the goods and services market and the financial market. Therefore, we need to study both of them. So, we'll start off by coming up with and discussing the goods and services market. And for the case of the goods and services market, the preamble was to explain to you the Keynesian cross and how it works. Just to recap, the Keynesian cross is a model that explains the relationship between planned expenditure and actual expenditure, and it's actually a model that explains how economies grow. And it's a closed economy model, which means net exports are not a part of the model, and it assumes that government spending and taxation are policy variables and assumes them to be fixed, while investment in this case is assumed to be planned investment, and planned investment is an exogenous variable which takes a value from outside. And using the Keynesian cross, we came up with an equilibrium scenario which we've discussed so far. This 45 degrees angle was where the planned expenditure was equal to the actual expenditure, and that's how we came up with is the equilibrium GDP, Y star. And this is where Y star was equal to E star, and therefore equilibrium was happening in the economy. Now, in order to come up with the IS curve, the Keynesian cross model is extended by making one small change in the Keynesian cross model. We modify the Keynesian cross model by changing the planned investment component. And we changed this by saying that investment, which was previously fixed and determined from outside, it was an exogenous variable, is now an endogenous variable. The model is going to be determining the value of investment. So, what we're saying is that investment now becomes endogenous, and investment is a function of interest rates. And this is the same interest rate that we've been talking about, which was the cost of doing business. So let's just put this in the model and see where we go from there. So the Keynesian cross model was like this. We had planned expenditure and actual GDP, and this was where planned expenditure was equal to the actual GDP, and then we had planned GDP, which was equal to consumption plus investment. But now investment is a function of interest rates plus government spending. Let's just call it E1. So we are using the ISLM model to explain the relationship between interest rates and GDP. That is what we're trying to explain. But the problem is that this relationship between interest rates and GDP is different in different markets. And in this particular model, we're talking about two markets, the goods and services market and the financial market. And we need to figure out what the relationship is like in both of these markets. So in order to explain what the relationship between interest rate and GDP is in the goods and services market, we need to make a couple of assumptions first. So we'll start off with the Keynesian cross model with investment now endogenized, and let's come up with some values. Let's say that when interest rates were 10%, when the value of R was 10%, the economy was at equilibrium and the GDP was 100. So when interest rates were 10%, the GDP was 100. So basically, on the graph, we're saying when interest rates were 10%, GDP was 100. So you come up with this equilibrium point, which we can show over here. Next, we say what would happen to the planned expenditure if interest rate changes from 10% and goes down to say let's say 5%. So when interest rates become 5%, cost of doing business goes down, investment increases. So in this equation, E is equal to C plus I plus G, E becomes bigger. When the value of investment becomes larger, the value of planned expenditure, E over here, becomes larger as well. When this becomes larger, the planned expenditure curve shifts and you have a new planned expenditure. You have a new planned expenditure E2, where C1 is the same as previously, but now investment is being done with 5% interest rate plus government spending is the same. So when the planned expenditure moves up, what happens to the equilibrium GDP? You have a new equilibrium GDP now, which is over here, and let's call this point P. The new equilibrium GDP is at point P, and what has happened is because of a change in interest rates, GDP has increased from 100 to 200. So at point B, at equilibrium B, interest rates are 5%, but the GDP has increased to 200. So this is point B. And if you connect these together, you come up with what's called the IS curve. What we need to understand is that point A was an equilibrium in the goods and services market. When interest rates changed, the economy moved from point A to point B. Point B is still an equilibrium in the goods and services market. What this means is that any point along the IS curve is basically a particular equilibrium point at a particular interest rate. So for example, if the interest rates had been 7%, then the GDP might have been say 150, and this point C would have been another equilibrium in the goods and services market. So the IS curve shows you combination of interest rates and GDP, which are equilibriums in the goods and services market. So just to recap what we've done, we started off with the Keynesian cross. To come up with the investment and saving curve, we need to endogenize investment. We endogenized investment by saying that investment was now a function of interest rates, and that we took into the Keynesian cross. Initially, we said that the economy was at equilibrium at point A, at which the GDP was 100 and interest rates were 10%. Then we said that when the interest rates changed to 5%, the cost of doing business went down. When the cost of doing business went down, investment increased. When investment increased, the total size of planned expenditure increased to E2. When this increased, the curve, the planned expenditure shifted upwards, and a new equilibrium was established at point P. At point P, the GDP is now higher. At lower interest rates, GDP has increased in the goods and services market, and then we plotted these 2 points, points A and B, on and on a graph with interest rates on the y-axis and GDP on the x-axis, and came up with a negatively sloped curve that is called the IS curve, and it's representing a combination of interest rates and GDPs that are equilibriums in the goods and services market. Now that we've come up with the IS curve, we want to figure out what causes shifts in the IS curve. So for that, let's just make another diagram. So we had planned expenditure on the y-axis. On x-axis we have the actual GDP, and we said that this line is where is equal to y, and it's showing you the equilibrium. And we said planned expenditure is equal to C plus I, which is a function of interest rates, and we're assuming them to be 10% plus G. And we said that at this level of interest rates, the GDP was, plotted these two on a graph with interest rates on the y-axis and GDP on the x-axis, and we said point A was where interest rates were 10% and GDP was 100. Was this point. When interest rates fell to 5%, GDP rose to 200, so this was called point P, and we combine this to come up with what's called the IS, or the investment saving curve. Now we want to figure out what causes a shift in the IS curve. So in order to explain the shift in the IS curve, we'll be discussing the scenario by starting from this graph and discussing what happens when we are at equilibrium A, and rather than interest rates changing, government spending increases. So the change in government spending is from G to G1. So it increases, and there is a change in government spending. What happens? If government spending increases, the value of this G over here increases. If the value of G increases, the value of E increases as well. And we come up with another value, let's call it E3 over here, and it's going to be representing C plus investment. It's still going to be 10%, but now government spending is different. It's G1. This G is different. So when this increases and moves up, what happens is that there is another equilibrium over here that's called point C. At point C, the GDP is 100, let's assume it's 150. So this is what we're saying. Equilibrium point C can be plotted on the graph as well now. At equilibrium point C, you see the interest rate is still 10%, but the GDP is different. It's actually 1. So at this equilibrium point, the GDP is now 150, but the interest rate is the same. So if you look at the lower graph that was representing the relationship between interest rates and GDP and was the IS curve, at 10% initially the GDP was 100. But because of a change in government spending, at 10% now the GDP is 150. So the GDP is 150 at 10%. And what has happened is this equilibrium point A is now at point C over here, and there is a shift in the IS curve. So the IS curve shifts when either government spending changes or if taxes change or if for some reason consumption patterns change. But basically the IS curve is going to shift if the fiscal policy changes. Recall, government spending and taxation are part of the fiscal policy. And normally when government spending goes up, IS curve moves upwards in this direction. When taxes go up, GDP is falling, so the IS curve moves in this direction. So just to recap, what we've done so far is that we've derived the IS curve, which is showing us multiple combinations of interest rates and GDPs along a curve that are equilibriums in the goods and services market. So these are multiple combinations of interest rates and GDPs that represent equilibriums in the goods and services market. And that we've derived by endogenizing interest rates into the investment, by endogenizing investments and making it a function of interest rates. And we've shown that you can come up with an with the IS curve by changing interest rates in the planned expenditure in the Keynesian cross model and figuring out what the new GDP is. And when you have multiple combinations of GDP and interest rates, you can plot them on a graph and come up with the IS curve. Besides this, we've discussed that the IS curve is going to be shifting if the government spending changes. Increase in government spending should cause the IS curve to move in this direction. Decrease in government spending should have a negative impact. Similarly, taxes going up means consumption is going down, which means the IS curve will move in this direction. Consumption's increasing would mean the IS curve's moving in this direction. So we'll stop over here, and in the next video we'll discuss the financial market